Let me paint you a picture. It's 2016. The Nobel Committee has just awarded the Nobel Prize in Literature to a musician for the first time in history. It is one of the most talked about Nobel decisions in decades. The entire literary world has an opinion about it. Bob Dylan's name is on the front page of every newspaper on the planet. And Bob Dylan doesn't show up to collect it. He doesn't call. He doesn't send a statement for weeks. When he finally acknowledges it, the response is so minimal and so characteristically indifferent that the Nobel Committee has to publicly wonder whether he even intends to accept. He eventually does. He sends a speech, read by the American ambassador on his behalf, because he has a prior commitment. That prior commitment is a concert in Las Vegas. He chose Las Vegas over Stockholm. That single moment tells you almost everything you need to know about Bob Dylan. A man who has spent 84 years being precisely, stubbornly, infuriatingly himself, regardless of what the moment called for, what the audience expected, or what the institution demanded. He has been booed off stages, accused of betrayal, written off multiple times by multiple generations. And he just kept going, changing, confounding, refusing to be pinned down, until the world eventually had no choice but to catch up with him. This is that story. Hibbing, Minnesota is not the kind of place that produces legends. It is a cold iron mining town in the northern part of the state where the landscape is flat and the winters are long, and the expectation, generally speaking, is that you will stay. Robert Allen Zimmerman had other ideas. As a teenager at Hibbing High School in the late 1950s, he was already forming bands and playing loud rock and roll covers of Little Richard and Elvis Presley. His volume was apparently so aggressive that school officials cut the microphone during at least one performance. The boy was 13 years old and already being silenced by authority. He would spend the rest of his career doing the opposite of being silenced. Something shifted as he approached graduation in 1959. Rock and roll was exciting, but it wasn't deep enough for what he was searching for. He wanted something older, stranger, more enduring. When he enrolled at the University of Minnesota in September of that year, he found it. Minneapolis introduced him to Dinkytown, a small, intense cultural pocket where folk music was treated not as entertainment but as tradition, history, protest, living document. In the coffee houses there, Zimmerman started becoming someone else. He shed his birth name and started calling himself Bob Dylan. He later denied it was a direct reference to the poet Dylan Thomas. But the association stuck, and he never fully corrected it, which tells you something about how deliberately he was constructing an identity. By January 1961, at 19 years old, he had made his decision. He left Minnesota in the middle of one of the coldest winters on record and headed to New York City. Not for fame exactly. For Woody Guthrie. Guthrie was not performing anymore. He was hospitalized at Greystone Park Psychiatric Hospital, suffering from Huntington's disease. Most 19-year-olds arriving in a new city with no money and no connections would not have that on their to-do list. Dylan sought him out anyway. Their meetings were brief. But what Dylan absorbed from them was not just songs, it was an entire philosophy. Music as narrative, as protest, as living history. Guthrie's influence became immediately audible in everything Dylan did in those early years. Back in Greenwich Village, he moved fast. By February 1961, he had secured a regular spot at Café Wa, performing multiple sets a day for almost no money to almost nobody. His style was already unusual: nasal voice, rapid delivery, an intensity that felt slightly unpredictable. The folk community was tight and competitive, and Dylan was essentially an outsider with no track record. But he absorbed everything around him. He borrowed melodies, reworked lyrics, reshaped traditional songs into something sharper and more personal. The turning point came in September 1961. Dylan performed at Gerd's Folk City, and a New York Times critic named Robert Shelton was in the audience. Shelton's review described him as a distinctive folk song stylist. That single article set off a chain reaction. Folk singer Carolyn Hester invited him to play harmonica on a recording session. The producer of that session was John Hammond, a Columbia Records legend who had previously signed Billie Holiday. Hammond noticed Dylan immediately and offered him a contract. From arriving in New York with nothing to signing with Columbia Records, 14 months. That is not a gradual rise. That is a calculated, relentless, single-minded infiltration of a scene that had no idea what it had just let in. In May 1963, Dylan released The Freewheelin' Bob Dylan, and the world changed its mind about what a song could do. 11 of the 13 tracks were original compositions. He was 22 years old. One of those songs was Blowin' in the Wind. 3 chords, 9 rhetorical questions about war and freedom and suffering, no answers. Within months, it had been covered by over 100 artists. Peter, Paul, and Mary's version sold 300,000 copies in its first week. It became an anthem without an owner, echoing through civil rights rallies and anti-war demonstrations across the country. On August 28, 1963, Dylan stood at the March on Washington alongside over 250,000 people and performed alongside Joan Baez on the same day Martin Luther King Jr. delivered his I Have a Dream speech. He was 22 years old. By 1965, people were calling him the voice of a generation. He openly resisted that label in every interview he gave. He deflected political interpretations. He refused to be claimed by any single movement or organization. He said the songs were the songs and people could do what they wanted with them. That distance was strategic, whether consciously or not, because it meant the music could travel further than any specific campaign or cause. Masters of War and A Hard Rain's A Gonna Fall weren't tied to particular legislation or particular moments. They addressed something broader: nuclear threat, systemic violence, moral failure, and that universality made them adaptable across decades and movements that Dylan himself had nothing to do with. He had become the defining voice of something he was already quietly preparing to abandon. July 25, 1965, Newport Folk Festival, Rhode Island. Bob Dylan walked on stage with a Fender Stratocaster instead of an acoustic guitar, backed by members of the Paul Butterfield Blues Band. The set lasted 15 minutes, 3 songs. The reaction in the crowd was immediate and fractured. Some people cheered, many booed, and the backlash that followed in folk music publications was sharp and personal. This was not just about sound, it was about identity. Folk music had positioned itself as authentic, grassroots, politically serious. Electric instruments meant commercial rock and roll, which meant selling out, which meant betraying everything the scene stood for. Dylan's decision cut directly through that ideology without apology. He didn't retreat. A month later, he released Highway 61 Revisited. Then came Like a Rolling Stone as a single, 6 minutes and 13 seconds long, at a time when radio wouldn't play anything over 3 minutes. Columbia Records hesitated. DJs started playing it anyway, sometimes cutting it in half to fit their slots. It reached number 2 on the Billboard Hot 100. The most famous moment of that entire electric period came on May 17, 1966, at a concert in Manchester. An audience member shouted Judas between songs. Dylan's response was 2 sentences. "I don't believe you. You're a liar." Then he turned to his band and told them to play it loud. They launched into Like a Rolling Stone at full volume. If you needed one moment to understand Bob Dylan, that is probably the one. On July 29, 1966, Dylan was involved in a motorcycle accident near Woodstock, New York. The details of the crash have always been vague. Intentionally so, many believe. What followed was not just physical recovery. It was a withdrawal from public life so deliberate and so complete that it became one of the most discussed disappearances in music history. He had married Sarah Lowndes quietly in November 1965, while the electric controversy was at its peak. By the end of the decade, they had 4 children together, and Dylan had adopted Sarah's daughter from a previous marriage. At an age when his contemporaries, the Beatles, the Rolling Stones, were becoming global media phenomena, Dylan was living in Woodstock, recording privately, and refusing almost every interview. He is not the most accessible figure in popular music. He is not easy to like in the conventional celebrity sense. He doesn't give audiences what they expect. He doesn't explain himself. He keeps his private life private with a discipline that borders on obsessive. He changes his most beloved songs until they're unrecognizable and then watches the audience figure out where they are. But here is what that consistency across 6 decades actually represents: a complete, uncompromising refusal to let fame define the work. A stubborn insistence that the craft matters more than the noise around it. A life lived on terms that nobody else set and nobody else gets to revise. At 84, Bob Dylan is still on a stage somewhere tonight. Not because he needs the money. Not because the industry expects it. But because the work is the point. It has always been the point. And everything else, the fame, the controversy, the Nobel Prize sitting in Stockholm, has always been, for him, beside it. That is not a complicated legacy. It is just a very rare one.